Hello, people. One of the problems I've had this year is making it to the gym regularly. And today, as I got on the bus, I was like, there's no way. So thank you for getting my running started for the summer. I sprinted from the bus downtown. I'm a little sweaty. Okay, so today is a lecture that's a continuation from yesterday, but with a little bit more guidance in the form of slides. And I really appreciate being asked to participate in this because one of my own nerdy interests is broadly called the philosophy of science, right? And as a sociologist in my own discipline, there is a subfield called the sociology of science, right? And so you all are embarking on a new path into the world of research. And my task today, as I understand it, is to introduce some very broad areas of research, broad concerns that may be common to all of you as you start to conceptualize and understand your specific research environment, okay? But as I was prepping these slides, I realized that I don't know enough about you all. How many of you in the room, show of hands, are likely to be working in social research, working with where your research subject is a human being? Okay, good. And then how many of you, just to get a proportion, will be in the natural sciences like physics, chemistry, biology? Okay, so half and half. My talk is, of course, going to be biased towards the social sciences. But some of these top-level concepts will be applicable for everybody. And from the point of view of understanding the logic, the philosophy, and the general context of the research act, doing research, okay? So I brought up these words yesterday. The concept of epistemology is important. It's a college word, right? Some people conceptualize philosophy as broken into four very general categories, those being logic, ethics, metaphysics, and then epistemology, right? The study of how we make new knowledge. All of you are going to be engaged in the task of making new knowledge. And I love that phrase, making new knowledge. Would you all like to repeat it with me? It's so great. Make new knowledge? Yeah, let's do it again. Make new knowledge. Right. So, and one of the reasons I find that particularly satisfying is because we often, especially as students, we internalize that we're paying money to get the knowledge, right? Our tuition is something that we work hard for. We make promises against the future that will pay back our student loans, right? And given that kind of promise into the uncertainty of the future, you want to feel like you're getting something for your dollar, right? Well, you all will be engaged in a task that is different from consumption of knowledge. You're going to be involved in the process of making new knowledge, right? Which is a creative act. There are people who say that creativity exists in society among who? The scientists and the artists, right? And in that way, both are engaged in creative acts, right? So what I'm going to talk about today kind of flows from this. Now, a subset of the science of making new knowledge is methodology. And methodology here, this is kind of a clunky definition, subfield of epistemology that might be called the science of finding out. Essentially, methodology is the subfield of how you structure inquiry. Now, that sounds also very vague, but I'm specifically using that word inquiry because some processes of making new knowledge don't require numbers. Some processes of making new knowledge use numbers, and they use them very sophisticatedly, right? So it's important also to recognize that there's a distinction, a conceptual distinction, and a process distinction between science and something that also investigates, like journalism, right? Journalism has its professional standards. They tend to be less rigorous than science, But if, as you can imagine, if a journalist breaches the ethics of their discipline, they can get in trouble, right? If they don't use the evidence to support their claims, which is what happened to Brian Williams. Okay, so how do I advance the slides? Is it just here? I'll do it. I thought maybe there would be institutional support for it. Methodologies can follow two different forms of logic, and you all probably know this, right? But one form of logic is called induction, and another form of logic is called deduction. Deduction is the form of logic that is embedded in all the Sherlock Holmes stories, right? Induction is separate. It's moving from looking at specific examples, multiple specific examples, and seeing if there's some sort of a pattern, which we might call a theory, that comes from your examination of case by case by case by case, right? Induction is associated with exploration, and induction is associated with discovery, right? So it's really fun to like watch National Geographic, where you see these people who have a lot of funding to go far away places and go into a deep, deep cave where no human has ever gone, right? And if you ask them, how do you feel when they're into the cave, they say, I feel great because I am seeing something that no one has ever seen before. Embedded in that concept is that they are making new knowledge by doing, by going there, right? Through exploration. Okay? I mean, I find it really interesting. When Mount St. Helens blew, it actually caused us to reformulate our phylogenetic tree because there were so many new species that got blown out of the crust of the earth that hadn't been on the surface of the earth for millennia, right? So whole new fields of archaebacteria that are now just 60 miles away in the forest surrounding Mount St. Helens, right? And it caused us to recreate our complete knowledge of the tree of life, right? So if you were just a scientist in Vancouver, Washington, and the mountain exploded and you went out to do your science, what would happen? You would discover new stuff and then become famous, right? So methodologies include methods that capitalize on this form of logic. Let's go out and discover things or explore, and we'll do it multiple times and see if some generality comes from that, right? Which we might call a theory, right? Or we can go forward with the theory and say, based on this theory, we're going to structure an investigation. And the investigation will map to the ideas in the theory, and when we collect our data, then we'll see whether the data actually separates out according to predictions. Does that make sense? Okay. In the general world of social science, right? And social science includes my discipline, sociology, but of course, psychology, economics, anthropology, history, if you do it in a certain kind of way, right? Those disciplines, the social science disciplines, generally speak about the tasks that you're going to do, research, in two ways. They generally speak about qualitative research or quantitative research, right? So if you were going to do an elevator ride with somebody and they say, hey, what are you doing this summer? Then the first thing you might say is like, oh, I'm doing a qualitative research project. And the person, if they're sophisticated, would be like, oh, yeah. I know what you're saying, right? Or you would say, yeah, and often you don't have to say quantitative research because it's assumed by default, right? If I'm doing research, you're probably using numbers and statistics and things, right? But quantitative research uses numerical data and has processes for assuring the precision, the accuracy, the reliability, the validity of those numbers, right? And the processes for collecting those numbers, okay? So in general, qualitative data is non-numerical. What's so cool about that is that you can use artifacts, right? So you could do qualitative research where your, what we call a unit of analysis is a photograph. And your data set is a bunch of pictures. And your job is to analyze the pictures, right? And report back on them. This actually is a familiar technique with program evaluations that are used in the real world, perhaps like a city, like Portland or Multnomah County, where they might be tasked to drive the streets of Portland and figure out which ones are dirty and you would take photographs of street by street by street, bring it back to an analyst, that would be you, and you would look through the photographs and come up with some sort of scheme to say, this photograph is clearly very dirty, right? This photograph illustrates a street that is intermediately dirty, right? And then here we have a street that is not dirty, also known as clean, right? And then you would create a report back to the people and say, the majority of the photographs that you provided for me illustrated in Portland, best city in the country, that the streets are clean, right? But wouldn't it be a surprise if you found a neighborhood where the streets are dirty? If you found a neighborhood where the streets are dirty, you might say, gosh, with a limited budget, we should focus on those streets. Does that make sense? Right? That's an example of what's called applied research, okay? And that's also an example of using non-numerical data to learn stuff, right? I mean, another approach to qualitative research is content analysis, where you look through text and you look for hidden messages in text, right? And so what you might do is read news reports, and you might say, well, in looking at multiple news reports over the year 2014, we see that this particular news source tends to be biased or skewed in favor of the president. Or alternatively, this other news source is biased or skewed against the president, right? And while they don't say the president is a jerk, we can say, the poorly thought out processes advanced by the administration, right? And we would highlight that and say, oh yeah, that's clearly against the policies of this administration, right? And so then you would total them from here and total them from here, and you would learn by reading the text and highlighting for hidden messages, what we also call latent content, right? The background messages, whether any particular source has a spin to it, has a bias, right? That's done all the time. Recently, we've learned that Fox News tends to be biased towards the right and tends not to fact check. Contrarily, right? Contrarily, MSNBC would be biased towards the left, right? And NPR, get out of here. Right? Okay. For those of you that are going to be doing work in the natural sciences, primarily you're going to be doing pure research, right? You're going to investigate chemical reactions. You're going to investigate the reaction of nematodes to some sort of chemical intervention, right? Or to a pharmaceutical or something like that. And from this perspective, we would call that pure research, specifically targeting the advancement of knowledge for quote-unquote knowledge's sake, right? And in the process of making new knowledge, your discovery that, some new antigen is present in some flatworm could be really important for other people's work, right? And it's worthy of your own advancement and promotion on your career to do that, but it may not be of immediate benefit to like your mom. Right, do you understand? Applied research, though, is research that serves daily life, right? That is organized to solve a problem in the quote-unquote real world, in your daily world. In my class that I had yesterday about the healthcare system, I speak of this. I say that, remember, physicians are trained in the natural sciences, but once they're on the job, physicians turn into applied scientists, where applied science is using the ideas of science for a specific solution, come up with a solution to a problem that helps people in general, right? And so in the world of medicine, who brings the problem? The patient brings the problem, right? You walk in, you interact with a physician, you say to her, hey, I've got this terrible rash, and she says back to you, I have some science for that. Right? Like my knowledge of chemistry and pathophysiology and pharmacology will help you, right? And so I'm going to bring everything that I learned at the university and then medical school to bear on the problem that you brought into my office today, right? And so they're going to solve the problem. All right. So that also kind of begs the question, is engineering science?
Yes.
Applied science.
You could call it an applied science, right? There is a strong argument for that. Because the general logic of making a hypothesis, right, asserting some propositions, doing some tests to see which of a couple of hypotheses are supported or refuted, right? That thought process is active in engineering design, right? Often, because engineering is so expensive, we do it inside a computer with the help of applications called simulators, right? We do simulations. But nonetheless, the logic of the scientific investigation is embedded in it, right? It's embedded in it, okay? So while broadly, I want to share with you that in the big world, science and engineering tend to stay separate. They have separate identities, the way we talked about, you all talked about yesterday, right? Nonetheless, the processes of investigation are common, right? It's like, let's collect data, let's think about stuff in advance, let's create controlled environments, and then we'll see which of our hypotheses is supported by the evidence, okay? This is true for both natural science and social science, that there's three general purposes to the research act, right, the research process. Primarily, there is exploration, which I've already spoken about. In the social world, there is a real need for exploration because the social world is so profoundly affected by new technology that when a new technology enters into society, there's a need to explore its effects, right, the ramifications of the new technology. So consequently, even though it becomes cliche, currently the impact of social media on all our pre-existing knowledge of the way society works, the impact of social media is the new area for investigation, right? The general idea that you can feel profoundly connected through your device, but when you sit on the bus, like I just did, everybody's sitting there looking at the tech, right? And so your internal report of whether you have an active supportive social network could be true. It's just we don't see you talking to anybody, right? And that paradox, which is new in history, I mean, since the 90s, is worthy of exploration and worthy of exploring whether or not we should revise all of our theories of the way society operates. Does that make sense? Okay. Description is very important as well. Description is one of the domains that qualitative research focuses on, where you go into an environment and your goal is to provide a very, what we call thick description. That's literally the jargon for it, thick description. And so anthropology does that. You can imagine a grad student going to this is the old view, right? Going to some rural tribe in the Amazon jungle and hanging with them and writing down everything they do, right? That's very stereotypical and somewhat racist kind of approach to doing research, right? We can also do anthropology in the city, where you learn of some new subgroup that is hanging out doing interesting, weird things, and then you become part of that and create in-depth reports for the advancement of knowledge, okay? By the end, I'm going to talk about a controversial study that did exactly that. And then explanation is a separate conceptual approach. Explanation requires the concept of causality, right? If we understand sufficiently the description of a phenomenon and we have a time dimension, then we can hope to argue that these input variables caused an output variable. And when we can do that, then we can say that we've explained, okay? Because we've said that these initial variables precede the variable of interest, and through our very careful control, we can say, well, we can rule out any other possible explanations. So when you include the time dimension, it is actually necessary for the task of explaining stuff, right? Explaining what's going on. So the purposes of exploratory research are fundamentally discovery. And what I'd like to offer to you is, just like my example of the cave explorers, you can also explore in the social world And of course, when you're doing benchtop research in the natural sciences, you can explore, you can find, you can collect novel research subjects in the form of your animals or whatever and see what happens, right? See what their characteristics are and publish about their characteristics. Exploratory studies are often motivated by an individual interest, by your own curiosity, right? And one of the things that I've learned being in this environment is that whenever you stand in front of a group of people and introduce your work, it is always legit, it is always accepted for you to say this. This is what I'm interested in. And that simple statement needs no backup, right? The room generally is supportive of everybody being intellectual and having their own thing, right? Their own interests. But once you stand in front of a room full of people and you say, my interest is in labor substitutions in medicine. People go, oh, okay, I don't know what that means, but good for you, right? And then the next step would be to explain what it means, right? In labor substitution, my interest is when you have, a job title that does certain kinds of work and then a new job title comes and does it also, like OBGYN versus midwives, right? You have midwives that come in and do that work. Or anesthesiologists who are being replaced by nurse anesthetists, right? And it becomes a very interesting question, like, who wants the nurse anesthetist instead of the doctor? And then we figure it out. It's like, well, the administrators do because they're cheaper. Right? Those kinds of things, okay? Exploratory research also is very valuable for developing new methods, right? For figuring out whether, not only, that's this one, develop new methods, whether there's actually sufficient data available, sufficient feasibility, sufficient interest in some new research agenda. Okay, you may have heard these words over the last couple of days. A research agenda is the general plan for doing multiple studies to provide a satisfactory solution to some unknown problem. Okay? And so all of you, as you enter into this world, should start thinking about that. What is your personal research agenda? And think about the multiple studies that you might do along that pathway. Right? The first step might be, well, is the research that I think about is actually doable? So you might formulate a pilot study that explores, right? Does that make sense? Right? Go out and figure out, and based on what you learn from the pilot study, it will inform you how you structure a more rigorous study. Okay? And then lastly, exploratory methods will help you, exploratory studies help you test new methods to see whether they work, and they're like preliminary steps. I'm introducing a word that we don't hear very often on this. This is the word nomothetic, and this comes from the philosophy of science. Nomothetic research is like specifically quantitative research, where the idea is that you are seeking norms, where nomo, the root nomo, connotes norms. Okay? So nomothetic research is trying to find independent variables that account for the variations in a given phenomena. You might replace that last word with a dependent variable, right, or your outcome variable. So what you're trying to find is, for example, a set of variables that together adequately predict what you're interested in. So this would be the logic that is the background to regression analysis, multiple regression analysis, right? Multivariate analysis. This is different from idiographic research, and idiographic is associated with the word qualitative, right? Where idio has the same root as idiosyncrasy, right? Specific, very specific. So these two general forms of logic are the background forms of thinking for these categories that I just introduced, quantitative and qualitative. The next series of slides will just lay out some very common designs that happen in the world of quantitative research, especially in the social sciences. But the logic also is useful for natural sciences that, could benefit from these structures, absolutely. Cross-sectional studies are studies that take place in a single point in time. We often call those snapshot studies, right? So if you were going to do a survey one time, we would call that cross-sectional, right? So you have a well-developed survey, you go out to society, you do it, you collect the data, and you analyze it, and it informs you about the situation at that time. Does that make sense? So another way to think about it, I mean, cross-section is, you know, a word from biology. You go in and you take a section of whatever you're studying and put it under the microscope, right? Same thing can be true for society. You can go out with a tool, and this is kind of fun, I don't think I've ever said this. A survey is like a scalpel, right? You take a section out of society and see what it looked like at that time, okay? Doesn't give you the before and after, doesn't give you the history, doesn't forecast the future, but it describes, at that point in time, the variability in your subject pool. Okay? Cross-section studies, observations of a sample or cross-section of a population or phenomena that are made at one point in time. The census can be thought of as a cross-sectional study in that it happens once every decade. However, a person could look at the results of the census over time and think of it as a series, right? But primarily, I think it's better to think of it as cross-section, okay? Longitudinal studies are studies over time. This permits the observation of the phenomena of interest over time, and that introduces into your investigation the possibility of discovering or characterizing change, right? Cross-sectional studies do not allow you to talk about change. Longitudinal studies do, right? So if you're interested in ideas of growth, development, evolution, right? Then you need change over time, right? Does that make sense? And so by now, you probably are appreciating that given your needs at the moment, there are designs that are better or worse for your current needs, right? Exploratory studies to get started. Maybe you need a description, so you do a cross-section, right? Cross-sectional study. And then, after you understand those things, then you propose change over time and recall that you need the time variable in order to explain things, right? Does that make sense? Okay. One type of longitudinal study is a trend study, and we're all familiar with the idea of trends. As a matter of fact, every day we get notices on our tag that something is trending, right? This is trending right now, and because we all want to be informed and on top of things, we pay attention to it. It's like, oh, look, it's trending, okay? What this does, though, is it pays attention to a specific population, right? So rather than very general change over time, it has a specific focus on the population at large. So this is where looking at the census as a series would become more like a trend analysis. Don't worry, they will not be a test. Yeah, go.
I've heard it's synonymous with trend studies to be called heuristical studies. Is that just like a colloquial of saying trend studies, or?
That's interesting. I have not heard that.
Okay.
Okay, in what environment did you hear that, though?
I don't know, it was like 2 years ago. People were talking. I don't remember. I kind of overheard them.
Yeah.
And I heard that blah, 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 trend studies, blah, 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 heuristical studies. So I don't have a good context of it.
No, I don't know, but it is really great to be able to bust out the word heuristic like that anytime. Okay? Right?
So I was thinking, is it a trend study of heuristics, or is that like a synonymous?
No. Because what is a heuristic device?
It's something that trends through time.
No. What is it? Say that again. A mental shortcut. No, that's sweet. A heuristic device is something that helps you understand something else, right? So we can, sometimes allegories, like in humanities, can be thought of as a heuristic device. Mnemonics can be heuristic devices, stuff like that, right? So the application of that word to this is new to me, and I don't know whether that's accurate or not. However, you should embrace the word heuristic. Okay? Another type of longitudinal study is a cohort study. And like I said, there's not going to be a test, but it's really common to get these things confused until you have practice with them. And whenever you hear these, you also need to have a healthy skepticism as to whether the people that speak it are being accurate, right? Because cohort studies can also be confused with the next slide, panel studies and things like that, right? So nonetheless, know that there are different types, and one of the things that I want you to do is come to peace with your own understanding of what these things mean. But a cohort study is a study that follows a specific group of people over time where group membership is associated with exposure to a specific event, right? Like a graduating high school class. That group of people is unified by having graduated at the same time. And you can study them over time. But no new people will be added to the cohort because they do not meet the criteria for membership. Does that make sense? Right? So we often study World War II vets as a cohort, right? A bunch of people who were in the military during World War II, and then we study how, especially their health has advanced across time. What this connotes here is that it's important, especially in the social, excuse me, I think that running messed me up. That in your studies, especially if at the beginning, you need to define what an appropriate case is, and this is true for the natural sciences and the social sciences. Case definition is an important step in your research, and generally that includes having some sort of in-group, out-group kind of criteria, right? What constitutes an appropriate case for study, okay? If you were working with animals, you would want to make sure that the animals are not genetically diverse, right? So in laboratories, I used to take care of all the rats in the psychology department and all the monkeys. And the rats were interesting because they were information property. They were, products of laboratories that assured that the genetic variation among the rats was minimized. So as you did your work with the rats, you knew that the animals were genetically very similar, and so you could rule out genetic variation as part of your cause, right? So and one of the things that's also interesting is to think of, genetically similar rats can be purchased as a product where the guarantee of product quality is there's no genetic variation, right? That's kind of interesting. And not clones. They were not clones, right? So that, I think, is also very interesting. Okay, and then a panel study is this, right? Same set of people each time. This is following folks as they move through. Have you all seen those movies like 7 Up, 14 Up, 21 Up? Do you know about them? These documentaries in England where the documentary filmmakers followed this same set of people who were 7 years old, and they followed them into, I think it was like 49 Up. And so after all that time, you could see how the pathways through life have affected people, right? So the people in the documentary would be a panel, and the act of doing the documentary would be the follow-up study, right? Where you would see how tracking these people over time would give us information about life choices, about opportunities, about successes and failures. So to clarify this in a single slide helps us understand the difference between trend, cohort, and panel studies. If we were interested in looking at the variable called religious affiliation, in a cohort study, in a trend study, what we might do is look at the shifts in the U.S. religious affiliations over time, and that's what the Gallup poll does. So it's not looking at the same people, they just regularly go out and sample the American public and ask the same question, okay? And that way they can tell us trends in religious affiliation. What is the current trend in religious affiliation? Do you all know? It's decreasing, where the concept of atheism is becoming more important, and people who had previously identified as very religious are now stepping away from it, right? So that is a current trend in American society. A cohort study might follow the religious affiliations among people that survived the Depression, right? So their in-group membership is defined by age group at a certain time, and then you track it over time and see how they become religious. And theory would suggest that people find religion as they approach death, right? As you get closer to leaving the crust of the earth, then becoming deeply philosophical and theological seems to be important to our species. And then the panel study would start with a sample of the whole population and study those specific individuals over time. But this is different because it's not defined by group membership, right? It's defined by the sampling procedure that the researcher conducts. So this is full of tiny words, but I really like this flow diagram. I used it in several of my classes. And what you should take away from it immediately is that this flow diagram has inside it a number of feedback loops. Do you see the feedback loops? At the top, in the dotted lines, we have a general thought process of coming to your research question, right? Somewhat motivated by your interests. Then you have ideas and theories. This isn't completely true because in your stage of development, one of the things you're going to do is also assess the environment for what's feasible. And what's feasible is defined by who your mentor is, right? So what this assumes is that you are an independent intellectual that is not necessarily in a hierarchical relationship. In this environment, you're tasked to help people who have already gone through this process, right? So you are intellectual labor. And the benefit to you is to internalize all these skills in this environment so that you can go out on your own eventually and be the mentor, right? Pay it forward, okay? But then we have these three columns that all then drop from the fundamental introspective, identification of what you're interested in and what you would like to work on, what you want to expend ATPs on, okay? What that requires is conceptualizing the theoretical environment, conceptualizing the structure of the research, right? Figuring out what kind of ideas are going to be involved in your research. Conceptualization could include things like capitalism, right? Religiosity, feminism, right? Those kinds of ideas, okay? And then you have to figure out how you're going to actually measure it with variables. And then you have to decide methods here, and you're going to decide who you're going to study and what approaches you're going to take to getting these people into your study, right? Sampling from the population. Where this is vitally important to make sure that the people that you study are logically representative of a larger group, right? For the goal of generalizing your work. So you decide all that, and then you decide how to take your observations, and this could be experimentation, right? You could do an experiment. You could also go out into the field and just observe, take notes, clipboard research, right? And at any rate, ultimately you have to bring back your data and analyze it in different ways, maybe with a computer, maybe with paper and pencil, maybe with sorting papers on the floor, right, as a first step. And then your analysis should lead to some sort of keyword jargon data reduction, where you take all the data and you represent it with either a final concept or some statistical value, right? And that way we can communicate with those statistics a lot of ideas in a single number or the outcome of a single inferential statistical test, like a correlation or a chi-square or something like that. And then the goal is to report and to apply, and what that does in time is provides feedback for the next iteration of research, okay? So I've just been given the 5-minute warning, so I'm going to go through these kind of quickly now. Idiographic research is qualitative, right? And qualitative research in general is exploratory. It's naturalistic because it collects data from everyday life, and after you collect enough, then maybe you'll see some sort of interesting pattern, right? See some sort of a unique emergent pattern with a general focus on emotions, feelings, attitudes, definitions, and observations of actual behaviors. Ethnography is a methodology that comes from anthropology, but it's widely used in the social sciences. Sociologists, psychologists use this technique all the time, and that tends to be nearly synonymous with field work, going out into the world, collecting notes, and interacting with people, and recalling, taking detailed notes and recalling later what they said. Case studies are a favorite of also anthropology, feminist research, but also law. Law uses case studies as the basis for establishing precedent, right? Business uses case studies to analyze the certain case of a successful business, and then you compare it to a different case of a similar business that didn't succeed, right? And that approach is to get lots of information about one case and to recognize whether there are emergent patterns that explain why one is successful or not. The qualitative interview is a type of interview that is very, very long and generally unstructured, so it feels like a conversation. But the purpose is to engage over time, literally like 2 hours with a person, and record everything, and then go back later and see what you got, right? Now, this isn't simply exploratory because the researcher has theories and motives for doing the work, right? So it's not necessarily structured like if I asked you, make a bunch of interview questions and then go out there and ask people, right? That would be called a structured interview. The qualitative interview, it leaves open in the interaction between two people the idea that the conversation can go anywhere, but generally on topic, right? Generally about the area of interest. There's 7 stages of interview, and I'm going to skip through this, but you have to think about it first, and then you design the interview, then you do the interview, then you have to transcribe, which is what you might have to do in your job, transcribing interviews for your mentor, analyzing, then you check back with the original source, and then you write the reports. Focus groups are group interviews. People don't often say it that way. It's a specific technique that's very, very well developed. And here at KSU, we have an international expert on focus groups, Dr. David Morgan. And it's very efficient because you can get a whole bunch of people in at once and ask them a similar question, and people will pop with their answers if they're so motivated. With all qualitative research, the primary responsibility is to take really great notes. And the general process, the methodological process, is to write down everything, even if it doesn't flow on the page, even if it's just some sort of idea that pops in your head, and then later you go back and analyze and rewrite your notes like you do for school, rewrite your notes, and then also write any new observations that emerge. I've done this with focus group research where we did focus groups out in Baker City, and we, what was it? Oh yeah, so it was me and my supervisor, and we drove out there, and we realized that in the drive back, we didn't have access to our notes, but it was essential that we start talking about it. So we recorded our conversation on the phone. And we talked through the observations that we shared, and then later went back and transcribed what we had recorded in the phone. So we captured the notes while they were fresh in our minds, and the novel idea was how are we going to do this? Let's talk into the phone. Okay, 1 minute warning, so we're going to keep doing this. I was tasked to talk about ethics really quickly. Within the world of research, it is absolutely important that we do not breach the trust of the people or the animals that we work with, right? In people research, these are the 3 primary criteria that we need to observe. That the participants recognize that they are volunteering. They've been informed to do it. We are tasked with never causing harm to people, and we also want to assure the promises of anonymity and confidentiality. If we deceive people, that deception must be justified, and people need to be debriefed all at the end. And honesty is a fundamental quality of professionalism, and so it should be encoded into your own personal identity, but it is also checked through our social systems. Okay, informed consent, we've talked about it, anonymity, confidentiality, debriefing. Institutional review boards are committees in every large institution, university, or think tank or hospital that supervise research proposals to make sure that you are being ethical, including doing research only if we don't know the answer. You don't want to repeat research because that's wasteful. And the institutional review board wants you to do research, but they also are going to check to make sure that your procedures are going to balance the cost and the benefit. Okay? For animals, there's a committee called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, which reviews research proposals that use animals to make sure that the use of lab animals is not egregious, that it's necessary, and that it's humane as possible. Okay? So if you are going to use animals in your research, you need to do that. I'm just going to flash these and then I'm going to be done. The current structure of our institutional review board criteria has been affected by a few main studies. One is the Stanley Milgram studies, where the students shocked other students and it freaked them out, right? Caused tremendous stress, so we now use that as a way to not do research. The Tuskegee syphilis study was egregious in that 399 subjects had syphilis but were never treated. 201 didn't have syphilis, but they weren't given prevention or health education to prevent it. And then in my discipline, there's this very weird study where a guy was studying homosexual behavior in public bathrooms and was a volunteer participant in this activity. Going into public with strangers and having random sex, and he turned it into his research, but he would wait outside and follow these people home. Does that sound creepy?
Yeah.
It does sound creepy, right? This was published in a very widely read, in the sociology world, widely read book called The Tea Room Trade, and now it's an example of don't do that, right? All right, that's my time. Thank you very much.